Good evening, everyone. We'll begin in just a couple more minutes. I want to give plenty of time for people to get on. So just wait with me 2 more minutes and we'll get started. Happy to have you all here. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Ryan Pennington, and this is the Amarillo Refugee State of the Union. I'm so excited that so many of you are joining us tonight. Before I get started, though, I want to just mention a couple things. First of all, registration did close at 7, so if you have friends who are trying to get on, they might not get through, and that's all right. They can find the live event streaming on Facebook, and we're also recording it, and so we will share it later after the fact. I'm so excited to celebrate with you about the refugee communities of this city. It is complex, it is interesting, and I have a lot to share with you tonight. Before I do that, I want to just thank a few organizations. I want to thank Amarillo College, who helped make a lot of this happen, as well as a number of local churches who have supported us monthly along the way. Also, our volunteers who joined us at a number of pivotal meetings with individual refugee communities, listening, taking notes, spending their Saturdays and Sundays learning and helping us to solve complex problems. And of course, our donors near and far who are supporting us monthly to make all of this happen. This is truly a unique endeavor. I hope you will see that tonight. Now that it's 7:05, I'd like to go ahead and begin. Couple other housekeeping issues. You are muted. Your videos will not show. You will only see me as well as Elizabeth toward the end of the presentation when she helps me facilitate the Q&A time. So as you listen, if you have questions tonight, please pass those questions along to us using the icon at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A icon. When you post questions there, we'll be able to respond. Our team will respond to those in real time and then mark some of them for me to follow up with at the end during the live Q&A time. And you're also welcome to mention anything in the chat as well. All right, let's get going. The outline for tonight is here on your screen. After a brief introduction, we'll talk about some definitions. What are the terms we use? What do those mean? And then we'll talk about the Amarillo refugee communities in particular. And then we'll survey briefly what organizations are working with refugees already and what are some of the things that they're doing. And then we'll compare this with what refugee communities themselves have expressed to us during our meetings with them. So that section 5, what refugee communities are saying, is all new. And you will be really interested to hear what they have to say. And connected to that will be a series of 7 recommendations that we have for the city. So if any part doesn't interest you, just stick on, and I promise you'll be enlightened toward the end when we get to that really important stuff. So a brief introduction about who we are as Refugee Language Project and why we are here. First, myself, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ryan Pennington. I founded the Refugee Language Project in 2017, and I'm currently its executive director. My PhD is in linguistics from James Cook University in Australia. And so that informs a lot of how I work with refugees here and analyzing their languages and cultures. Previously, from 2009 to 2016, I worked as a field linguist in Papua New Guinea with Wycliffe Bible translators. Our organization, the Refugee Language Project, its mission statement is removing language barriers, building leaders, and cultivating community among refugees of the Texas Panhandle. So what this has actually meant in practice is that we've had specific initiatives such as literacy classes focused on Somali women, face-to-face program, some community events like our Table Talk program, a number of leadership development initiatives, as well as language and culture trainings with local schools and local leaders. But tonight is not about Refugee Language Project. Tonight is about the refugees of Amarillo and about celebrating what all of us are doing together and informing you all so that you can be empowered to be agents for change. So today's goals are to equip leaders to effectively engage the complex network of refugee communities in the city and to amplify the voices of those refugees who shared with us at those meetings. I want you to hear what they had to say. And hopefully to inspire new collaborative initiatives to address those gaps that we see and creatively solve problems. For those of you outside of Amarillo, I hope that you can watch the solutions that we found and maybe emulate them in your own context. Hopefully it will be informative for you as well. Some definitions, the meanings of the terms we use, and the numbers that they represent worldwide. Before I mention some of those words, I just want to ground this in a person. I want to talk about my friend Samuel. Samuel, really inspiring guy here in this city who was born at the outbreak of the Second Congo War. And actually, I want to jump to the next slide and just track with you the path that he followed. So he was born right here in Southern Democratic Republic of Congo, Southern DRC, in 1998. There's a picture of him as a child. Because he was born into war, it wasn't long before they fled to Rwanda. Okay. In fact, in their minds, Congo and Rwanda, interchangeable. It was a very confusing situation. So they didn't announce themselves as asylum seekers in Rwanda. They actually later fled again to the country of Kenya, where they actually sought asylum. Okay. And that was by 2008, they had done that. Samuel went to school in Kenya, eventually dropped out of school, actually, and just sold sausages on the street for $2 a day to care for his family after his father had died. But later, a pastor saw him and encouraged him to get back in school and paid his school fees. And Samuel excelled, learning English in the process at a Swahili-speaking school. And eventually, 10 years later, resettled as a refugee in Amarillo in 2018. There's a picture of him with his beautiful mother. So this shows two important terms that I need you to understand. First, asylum seeker. This word's in the news a lot. When a person flees across an international border, they must seek official sanctuary by applying for asylum. which is the right to be recognized as a refugee and receive legal protection and material assistance. While waiting on that application process, they're called asylum seekers. They're waiting on asylum. These are people whose claims as refugees have not been definitively proven. So that describes their situation through most of their time in Kenya. Later, that changes. So a refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. War, as well as ethnic, tribal, or religious violence are the leading causes of refugees today. Crucially, someone cannot just raise their hand and say, I'm a refugee. It's a legal status. They must be registered with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. People who cross the southern border of Texas, for example, are not refugees unless they have sought asylum and had their case vetted. Okay, so I just want to make sure that you understand that distinction going forward. So some numbers worldwide in 2000, this was actually these statistics were from mid-2020. We had 80 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. Those are people removed from their homes who have fled, but only 26 million of that number are actually vetted and approved as refugees, 26 million. Okay, 4.2 million are asylum seekers. 68% of those came from just 5 countries, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And Syria and Venezuela are not represented, but Afghanis, South Sudanese, and Burmese are represented here in Amarillo. There's a presidential determination which makes its way in the news each year, where the president sets the refugee admission ceiling, the maximum number of refugees allowed to settle in the USA for the following year. And you see the trends there. In 2020, that number was at 18,000. For 2021, that number has been reduced to 15,000, as well as extending the disallowance of refugees from the nations of Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. So this chart might help you to just understand the overall picture. This is since 1980. That blue line is the ceiling that was set for each year. But the orange line is actually how many were admitted, because it's the max that can be admitted as that blue line, but seldom do we actually reach that ceiling. But I don't want to focus too much on statistics because our focus tonight is about our local neighborhoods. So zooming in a little bit, there's a recent history of Texas resettlement. In 2016, we had over 8,300 statewide resettled, and that dropped to 2,227 in 2019. You might remember that Governor Abbott accepted the Trump administration's offer to disallow resettlement for the state in January 2020. But later, that executive order by President Trump was actually overturned in the courts, rendering Governor Abbott's decision moot. So even though that was in the news, Texas has continued to settle refugees since that time. What's very important for our local context is secondary migration. After resettlement, refugees are accorded freedom of movement around the country, just like every citizen. And when they relocate, this is called secondary migration, and it's exceedingly common. It's often for the purpose of finding a job or reconnecting with family. We see that borne out here. The Texas Panhandle's low cost of living, job availability, and stabilized populations of refugee communities already here will continue to draw secondary migrants from around the USA, even if Amarillo resettled no refugees. We would still have incoming refugees or former refugees in the way of secondary migration. It's important to be aware of that fact. And now I want to talk more specifically about the nationalities, ethnicities, and communities who call Amarillo home. And I want to remind you all that we have a Q&A dialogue at the bottom. If you have questions that this sparks in your mind, go ahead and ask them there, because Elizabeth is processing those and she'll feed those to me at the end for a Q&A time. So don't be afraid to ask them now. This chart depicts the trend of Amarillo refugees since 2010. You see a high in 2010 of 767, and you see in the fiscal year 2020, 113 refugees resettled in this city. You all should know that these resettlements come from two local agencies, both Refugee Services of Texas and Catholic Charities of the Texas Panhandle. So this chart compares those two organizations. And you'll see that in 2020, Catholic Charities resettled 68, while RST, Refugee Services of Texas, resettled 45 right here in Amarillo. Who are they? Well, here's a breakdown by continent. You'll see that over 50% have come from the continent of Asia. And interestingly, even though in the national dialogue, we hear about the Americas a lot, people are thinking of refugees and thinking of the southern border. But when we're talking about refugees, there have only been 8 individuals resettled from the Americas since 2015. More specifically, the nationalities that have been resettled here. We see over half since 2015 are from the nation of Burma or Myanmar. Second place goes to Congo, also Iran, Somalia, and Afghanistan round out the top 5. Others include Rwanda, Burundi, Dominican Republic are those 8, by the way, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Iraq, and Vietnam. Since 2018, though, I want you to see a more current picture. Congolese have actually taken the lead over those last few years. Over 50% of the resettlements, 214 individuals since 2018, have been from the nation of Congo. And of course, Burma is still a high number with 135. One other term I want to point out, because this will be important going forward. We use the term refugee community. I use the term refugee community to refer to specific immigrant communities composed primarily of people who initially came as refugees. So an example locally would be the Lao community. Even though a majority of Lao people became citizens long ago and are therefore no longer refugees. However, even though they are no longer refugees and many of their children were never refugees, their community experiences many of the same language and culture barriers and social stigmas that current refugees do. So we use refugee community to communicate about those groups of people. And here is a very complex picture of the refugee communities of Amarillo. And I want you to just take a moment wherever you are and stare at this picture, this diagram of the complexity and diversity we see in just this one city. If you live elsewhere, though the names, the specific groups are going to be different, the diversity and the complexity is likely to be similar. You see people from Somalia, you see Somali Bantu people from South Sudan, Burundi, Congo, etc. It is really quite the picture to see. And I want you to see that and face that reality. And I want to talk more about that. So to do that, I'd like to zoom in now on just the Burmese sub-communities of Amarillo. So often when I hear school districts or other local leaders talk about refugees, they'll mention in passing Burmese people. And many of them understand this complexity, but I want to cover this important issue, and that is that Burmese does not mean a lot. It just means a nationality. So all these groups, the Chin ethno-linguistic community, the Chin group, the big bubble there, the Karen bubble, and Burmese, those are major ethnicities. And then off of those are specific churches and organizations and dialects and languages that group together naturally. Those are the sub-communities, okay? So when we talk about Burmese people, we're actually talking about a number of different groups of people. So Burmese can refer to a nationality, sure, but it can also refer to the Burmese ethnicity, or it can refer to the Burmese language, which is actually more like a trade language for many people, spoken just like French or Swahili would be used in Africa. Amarillo has at least the following communities just from the nation of Myanmar: Burmese ethnicity, Karen, Karenni, Kachin, Mon, and Chin. And then among the Chin, we have Hakalai Chin and Zotun Chin and Falam, Zomi, Mizo, Tidim. All of these are specific Chin languages, and they group with one another separately. And many of them do not identify as Burmese. So we've established that refugee communities tend to cluster into sub-communities, not based on nationality, but language, clan, religious affiliation. And each of these sub-communities establishes their own leadership structure, their own communication channels. They have to care for one another. And certain key individuals in those sub-communities serve as critical bridges between multiple sub-communities. And that's where I want local leaders to pay attention. Those of you who are in charge in some local institution, some local organization, I want you to understand there are certain people who are already in a place. They're critical bridges for you. Okay, people in the Karen community organization that have members from Buddhist and Christian groups from all local Karen churches as a part of their community organization. We have Eastridge Baptist Church, which has multiple groups meeting at the same time. They have Lao, Karen, Karenni, all meeting under their same roof. First Baptist is another example of that. Then you have Burmese Emmanuel Revival Church, which has members of the Chin, Burmese, and Karen communities. Those leaders in those places are positioned well to communicate with multiple groups. So I want you to keep that in mind going forward as you intend to work with these communities. And zooming back out, I just want you to see the full picture again, and we'll make this chart available to you all. It's not perfect, it's not complete. I haven't spent very much time with Iranians, so I'm sure there's so many more sub-communities, but the point is not here to help you understand everything. The point is for you to just see the complexity and understand what it takes to communicate and effectively engage that diversity. Using that as a backdrop, let's talk about what local organizations are actually doing. First, I already mentioned the 2 resettlement agencies, and I could say so much about what they're doing. They provide the important, crucial services, especially in the first 5 years after arrival. Not only do they resettle people, but they provide case management, career counseling, English education, and many other services. I could not possibly list them all. But crucially, their funding from the government lasts for those first 5 years. After that point, local organizations have to pick up the slack. So I want to just mention a few of the organizations that are working with different refugee communities, but I can't mention them all. So, we have a number of mentorship programs in the city, really exciting opportunities. We have Refugee Language Project's face-to-face program. Catholic Charities has just launched a new youth mentorship program, which is really exciting. Mission Amarillo, Spiro Legacy, Square Mile, and I'm sure there are others who are trying to connect people on a one-on-one level. And in every case, there are incredible stories of people overcoming adversity and becoming leaders. So I want to celebrate these organizations that are doing these unique and difficult things. And then there's so much else. I initially had so many slides to cover this, and I just don't have the time tonight. We will share that with you, the resources, the available organizations in a coming date, in a document. But tonight, I just want to survey a few of those. We have 2 big after-school programs in Eastridge Mission Center and Mission 2540. Catholic Charities and Legal Aid of Northwest Texas offer legal support. We have food provision from a number of local organizations, medical services. Okay, I was excited to hear, for example, about Eastridge Mission Center's vaccine clinics that they do in partnership with Heal the City. And then we have Mission Amarillo. We have Storybridge, which delivers books to children. Really exciting things that they're doing here. Panhandle Community Services, so many more. Cactus, up in Cactus, there's Cactus Nazarene Ministry Center, which is kind of accomplishing all of these tasks and more under their own umbrella because they're a bit more isolated. So when you're looking for places to serve, we've got you covered. There are organizations here who are doing really, really good things. And then there are individuals. So many individuals, I'm sure I don't know, but a fraction of the people who are serving refugees just in their own lives. They're not asking for attention. Evelyn Lyles has been doing apartment ministry at Astoria Park since 2006. She answers so many urgent needs for refugees. I can't imagine anyone who has done more to help refugees in their time of need than Evelyn. Okay, and there are others. So I want to just celebrate that. Like the Amarillo is doing so many things, and it is remarkable and honorable what they're doing. And they're not asking for credit. Most of them are just doing the work day after day. And I'm just eager to work with them and partner with them. I want to honor them in everything I say. I want to talk more at length about the ESL programs because it's such a broad category here. There are so many groups who are serving refugee communities with English help. There's, of course, the local Amarillo College. There's Amarillo Public Library. There are 3 nonprofits, and then there are 5 churches. And then, of course, Cactus Nazarene Ministry Center. So here's just a map of Amarillo showing you the blue are the nonprofit organizations. The green are the public institutions, AC and the library, and the red are the churches who are serving Amarillo's refugee communities in this way. And we'll share this, of course, with you as well. This chart helps us to see the workload that each of these organizations have. You have Amarillo College up through 2020. By the way, these numbers are based pre-pandemic because the pandemic has thrown everything out of whack, and it wasn't useful to try to understand the statistics since that time. But at last check, Amarillo College had 23%, Paramount Baptist 22%, First Baptist 16%. And in partnership, the Library and Refugee Language Project had 16%. So you see all of the organizations serving Amarillo's refugee communities. What's interesting is since 2017, those programs, several of them have shrunk a lot. And those are due to many factors that I don't need to go into here. But it has definitely caused them to ask questions about how we re-engage refugee communities. You'll see that Catholic Charities has been growing their program significantly in their approach since 2018, especially. This is an important chart. Over half, a full 59%, based on the enrollment numbers that all of those churches and organizations provided, 59% of those enrolled students were at the literacy and beginning levels. So that's a very large percentage of the Amarillo refugee communities who are just beginning to learn English. Intermediate was at 29% and just a paltry 12% for the advanced level. And my guess is that that picture is borne out in other towns that tend to attract secondary migrants due to factory jobs, such as our meatpacking industry. So here are some lessons I can pull out. One, like I just mentioned, Amarillo attracts a ton of beginners and pre-literates, especially because those jobs attract people who don't know English. So wherever they've been settled in whatever city, eventually they find their way. If they're struggling to learn English, they find their way to places like Amarillo because these jobs pay pretty well, full-time with benefits for people who have 0 English proficiency. The actual enrollment numbers, though, that I shared are probably quite a bit lower because a lot of these students are attending multiple programs simultaneously. It's important to keep that in mind. One thing I noticed is that even though Congolese people have been the top group coming in, they are not represented very well in our ESL programs. They're just not attending them like I wish they would. So that's an important thing to note going forward. The features that appear most correlated with high enrollment numbers, those programs that are just consistently doing well, they have beginner classes, they offer childcare, they offer transportation, and they've been in the community a long time. Refugee communities trust them to care for their own interests. And by the way, let me just mention that these ESL programs do so much more than ESL. They teach citizenship, of course, but those teachers are doing just like Evelyn Lyles did. They're opening their mail and helping them understand that this car warranty you can ignore and throw in the trash. Okay, so these programs serve a crucial, vital role for this city, and we shouldn't overlook what groups like Paramount Baptist Church and First Baptist Church are doing. Amarillo College maintains very high numbers in spite of a lack of childcare or transportation, due at least to the following factors. One, reverence for academic institutions. People want to be attached to an actual college where accreditation is possible in the future. Two, they offer multiple class times per week, and most of our local nonprofits and churches just simply don't have the capacity to meet 2 and 3 and 4 times a week. And finally, it's important to note that Amarillo College doesn't have any religious overtones. They don't offer devotional. So communities who don't come from a Christian background feel more comfortable often in places like that. And finally, there appears to be a very strong appetite for classes geared towards specific refugee communities. One example I'd like to highlight is Persian Elevate Church, where Matthew Salar is teaching a class for Farsi and Dari speakers because he's able to get them right where they're at and focus on their context. And our own Refugee Language Project's Somali Women's Literacy class as well. I believe other programs like that, for example, a program focused on Congolese women, would probably thrive here. And now I want to get to some really exciting stuff. I apologize if you are in an organization that I didn't mention. Just recognize just how much Amarillo is doing and celebrate with me. It's just, we live in a very generous, servant-hearted city. We met in 2019 and 2020 with 4 refugee communities in order to identify specific problems and consider some concrete solutions. So I want to show you on that diagram who we met with, okay? We met with the Chin community at Burmese Emmanuel Revival Church. So there were others represented, but primarily Chin. Then we met with what we called African Christians. These were people from nations such as Congo, Burundi, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea. We met in a church and we brought together those people who have similar shared experiences. Then we met with the Karen community. And finally, we met with the Somali community. And so you see the coverage. And actually, we intended to meet with people from the Middle East. We intended to meet with people from previous waves, such as Lao and Vietnamese, but we just didn't get the time before the pandemic struck. But we had pretty good coverage on this diagram anyway. And here's what we did. We shared from the front our main topic, and then we talked about coming and going, community places, where people gather. We just sensed that that was an important thing to talk about. How people are celebrating their culture, and business ideas, how they're earning their income, etc. And we compared their past and their present to help scaffold, to help refugee communities think in comparing those to think about what could be in the future. And we mix small group discussions and then whole group debriefs. In those small groups, we had facilitators and scribes, and they were instructed not to share their own opinions. We were there to listen, and that is what we did. And we wrote down everything that we could hear. And then later, I sat down and poured through pages and pages of notes to catalog what was said in a way that I could distribute now tonight to you. Here's just one picture from the last meeting when we actually met in the Somali mosque. Just celebrate with me what you see here. You have administrators and instructors from Amarillo College sitting on the floor of the mosque, going into their space to ask them, what are you struggling with? How are you struggling with education? Why aren't you attending this program or that? It was fascinating. And I'll tell you what, the Somali community embraced those people, and now they still talk about it. It is celebrated over and over in their community about what was done that night. So I just want to celebrate Amarillo College for attending, giving up their Saturday night alongside our volunteers, as well as, by the way, people from local elementary schools. And here's an example of that whole group debrief time, where we would come together and pull out what was said and compare the past, present, and future. So we talked about coming and going. Why are people coming to Amarillo? Why are people leaving? And then what would cause them to stay? And I'm going to talk more about that toward the end tonight, why we asked that question. When we asked why people are coming, we already knew the answer and we heard it over and over again. Secondary migrants are coming to work in meatpacking plants and to reconnect with family. That is what we're seeing. Okay. Nothing revolutionary there, but it is important to recognize. Now, the rest of this section, you're going to see these charts. Okay, these charts show the different responses that were given in different themes. You have the African Christian meeting in purple, the Chin in red, Karen in orange, and then the Somali is in blue, but they didn't actually answer this question that night. But when we asked, why are people leaving Amarillo? Okay, 24 people, 24 mentions in those notes, mentioned better jobs. Okay, that's why people are leaving. And then a number of people also mentioned benefits. Okay, so when they mention better jobs, they're saying we're struggling in the meatpacking industry. And I want to pause real quick and say they were not complaining. In fact, over and over and over again, the refugee communities of this city, when we asked them about meatpacking work, they said, we love our jobs. We're grateful. We have jobs. We get to sleep at night feeling safe in our beds. We escaped war. We are grateful for what we have here. They're not asking for a change to that. We were asking, okay? And what we were learning is that eventually, even though they're grateful, eventually those jobs are breaking down their bodies. Spouses are working opposite shifts, long shifts, they never get time together. They don't have the energy left over to study and have some upward mobility. So their families break down and eventually they get discouraged and try somewhere else. What was mentioned a number of times is that they would be happy even to take less pay for the second income earner of the family, to maybe take a risk in a business endeavor or to work in a lower paying factory job that they perceived would be less dangerous or reserve more time and energy for their families. And of course, benefits, this is something I'm not going to spend time on because it's not something I feel like I can change, but especially the elderly and disabled were mentioned. And that's one thing that would draw them to other places, such as Minneapolis, Minnesota, for example. And finally, a perceived easier road to citizenship was mentioned by a number of people. And we asked, what would cause them to stay? If something was different, what would lead those people to stay here? And of course, better jobs and benefits, but also community support, educational opportunities, and farmland. The Karen people talked about farmland. So what do we mean by community support? They want access to our city. They feel like they're on the outs. Many of them feel like they don't have a way to impact local policy or to feel like they're part of the solution. They want representation. They want places to gather to feel like they belong. Also, a lot of people mentioned just lamenting the fact that a lot of their children are settling for work in factories because they came too late to do well in our school system. And so they end up going into those factories, and the parents of those kids feel like they have failed them when that happens, because they are here hoping the best for their children, which is something I can relate to. Don't we all want the best for our children? And they also talked, of course, about life skills and literacy class opportunities. We need more of that, they said. And farmland, not garden plot at my apartment complex, but larger scale farmland, the kind of farming that they participated in back home to connect with their culture and skills was mentioned. We also asked about community places. Where did you gather back home? Compare that with here. And would a community center help you? So when we asked, where did you gather with others back home? House of worship was the number one. Okay, and that's the same for me and for so many here. But crucially, shops was number two, and not just shops, but marketplaces, places to gather and do trade, buy and sell. It was very clear in that meeting, in all of those meetings, that the business environment to buy and sell is not about money as much as it is about relationship. But when we compare that to Amarillo, the houses of worship were mentioned way more. It's like we need that more than ever. So they just couldn't stop talking about the places they worship. But at the same time, that's held in tension with the fact that many of them are borrowing space from other churches to worship, for example, on a Sunday afternoon for 2 or 3 hours. So even though it's more important than ever, they actually don't have access to that space all the time, which is a real challenge. Many of them live in apartment complexes. They can't invite a lot of people. And so what they end up doing is renting spaces. Let's see, I think I already covered this, house of worship and homes. So they meet in rental spaces. Very few options available, so they'll rent the Civic Center for weddings, funerals, cultural events. And they talked about shops and markets, how important it was, but few have been able to open them here. They mentioned one African-owned store that was actually doing really well by their recounting, but ended up having to close because people from the community, from the African community, were gathering and loitering in the parking lot, upsetting all of the other tenants, which I can understand. I wouldn't like that if I was a neighboring tenant, but it should show us how important that space was for the community. So there's something there that needs to be fostered, even if it needs to be fostered in a way that works in our systems. So we asked, how would a community center help you? And so many reasons why a multicultural approach would help. Relationships across cultures, which mentioned over and over, a place for them to connect with people who are different from them, to build unity in our city, but then also unity within their in-groups, to have cultural celebrations, and of course, education, maybe a market, other access to resources, etc. There were concerns. People mentioned the lack of time and energy that they have to participate. They mentioned the fear of cultural or religious conflicts. And finally, they mentioned, or they helped us see that multiculturalism, while an important part of the American ideal for many of us, does not necessarily transfer. People don't necessarily have that ideal in their own cultures. And so they have to be taught to celebrate that idea that we are better than the sum of our parts. So multicultural community center definitely has its issues ahead of it as far as selling it even to the people it's meant to benefit the most. And then we talked about culture. How did people celebrate their culture back home? What skills did they have? What handicrafts did people make? And then compare that with what's happening in Amarillo. And this next chart just gives me chills, okay? These are the skills that people expressed having in their home countries. So many of us focus on all the things refugees have lost, all the things, all the difficulties, the challenges. But I just want you to look at the diversity of cultural expression that is in our city now. People made clothing, so many of them mentioned crops and livestock. Culinary interests. Every group mentioned making wooden furniture, baskets, jewelry, pottery, woodworking, carpentry, metalworking, and on it goes. And I just love seeing that because it shows that people have a lot to offer here. But when we compared that with what they're doing here, they said, well, here we celebrate our culture with our annual national or religious event, and we teach our children. Those other things got wrapped into a discussion about just discussing loss, about the loss of their language, loss of culture, loss of their crafts. So they didn't talk much about living out their culture here by producing those same handicrafts. So we have Chin National Day, Ramadan, Karen New Year, South Sudanese Independence Day, and others. These were the most important moments of their calendar that allowed them to reconnect with their heritage and teaching children. There's a Chin language school every summer where they teach children their own language. They speak Arabic at home, for example. I want to mention briefly the difference between assimilation and integration, because so many people talk about, oh, we just need to assimilate them. And I want to remind you all that actually the healthiest approach is integration, where refugee communities can not only adapt to our larger society, but also celebrate their own cultural heritage. Those refugee communities who are doing that well, such as several of the Chin groups, they are the ones thriving the most in our local city. Those who are casting off their own cultural heritage are struggling because there's a disconnect between children and parents. And those who are holding on to their cultural heritage and rejecting American culture, of course, they are struggling as well. Finally, we talked about business, comparing back home to Amarillo. How did you earn income? What new ideas interest you? And at the top of that list, every group, every small group, all they talked about, farming, crops, livestock, and small business sales, often connected, right? I grew this and I sold it at the market. The people who find their way to Amarillo, who are often low levels of English, have low levels of English, they come from farming backgrounds in Africa and in Asia. So those people know how to sell and trade. They know how to grow things and work with livestock. But here, they have not been able to utilize those skills at all. Because when we asked, how do you earn income here? Every group, all they talked about was meatpacking. Very few mentioned anything else, except for Somali people who talked about small business ownership. And they're known worldwide for being very entrepreneurial, and they're doing well in that respect here in Amarillo. But other groups are struggling to make their way in this manner. So I'll go ahead and move on. I do want to mention Lao communities had done well in the past to open a number of the restaurants we see. Lao and Thai restaurants scatter Amarillo, but more of the recent refugee resettlees have not succeeded there.
Hey, Ryan, before you move on from business, I have a question from a listener that I'd like to send to you.
Sure.
They're wondering, can you point us to where we can read more on benefits that are uniquely desired by refugees communities, specifically as business people who try to attract talent and labor help in our organizations? I would love to hear more about the company benefits that attract and sustainably support refugee communities. I think this is an underappreciated way to signal to prospective workers that we have done some legwork to understand how to support them and their families.
Well, yeah, that's a really challenging question to answer here in this context. Let me think more on that answer and get back to you. Elizabeth, please write that down and let me reflect on that, because I'm not actually sure how to answer that well now. So I'll go ahead and keep moving on. Sorry to not address that directly yet. So we asked what new business ideas do interest you. A lot of different ideas, but especially small shops, markets, restaurants, and farming and livestock, as well as clothing. And then a number of people mentioned daycare. And what we can see in this picture of what refugee communities expressed is that they want to serve their own communities. And business owners are most capable of caring for their own people. And so when they're talking about daycares, they're saying, we need daycares, we need childcare access. We'd love to get help opening those to care for our communities. And I want to mention a few quotes that we got from these meetings. We asked if you could say something to the people of Amarillo, if you could share your own culture with us, what would you say? And here are a few. We want to share our festivals with the people of Amarillo. We want to help you learn to show respect for elders. We want to have a place to come for Amarillo to see our culture. We don't know how to discipline children in American culture. We want you to know what our people went through in our past. We can teach you to cook our food. We are not criminals. We came here to escape war, not to create war here. We want them to know that we love them and want to be with them and share our culture with them. We are willing to teach you lessons about our cultures. And I shared this picture at this moment because especially the African Christian groups, that meeting, it just came out over and over how much they adore Amarillo. They love this place. It reminds them in many ways of home. And so I want to celebrate them and help them thrive here. And that leads to our recommendations for the city. We recommend that local leaders, local partners collaborate to establish a refugee community leadership council where leaders can address their own overlapping felt needs, share their specific needs with city leaders, hear from local leaders about new programs, initiatives, and concerns, and raise up youth as future leaders. This is something I've been reflecting on for quite some time. I think it would solve a lot of problems here. Number 2, we recommend that local partners collaborate to open a community center where cultures can be celebrated, community gatherings can be held, classes and tutoring can be offered, and a handicraft market can be operated to help foster some of those deep felt needs among the refugee communities. 3, we recommend that new partners rise up to engage refugee communities by forming a business development program of some sort where new businesses are incubated, business mentorships are fostered, business English can be taught, and new farming initiatives can be explored. You've heard me talk a lot about farming. I don't have a specific initiative in mind, but Amarillo should be able to bridge that gap for these communities. This should be a place where people, refugee communities, are enabled to utilize their farming expertise. I also want to mention that men don't gravitate toward ESL programs, but a business program, they will. And they'll learn English just as they have learned multiple other languages in their past, if they have a reason to do so. In our present environment, working at the meatpacking plants, they simply don't have a reason to work to learn English. There's nothing drawing that, but a business program would. Adult education. We recommend that organizations in Amarillo who offer ESL instruction critically examine their own unique strengths in comparison to other partners in order that overlooked refugee communities, such as the Congolese, can be better served. Increased opportunities are provided outside of church buildings to enable people who aren't comfortable there to participate, and where low English levels are prioritized even further with daily repetitive classes. This is needed in Amarillo. Mother tongue education. Those of you educated in this idea will understand. For many of you, this won't make a lot of sense, but it is important to mention. We recommend that mother tongue education be promoted wherever possible. by providing literacy materials in heritage languages. This is, by the way, where StoryBridge might come into play. Supporting grassroots educational initiatives such as Chin language classes. Why can't we help them do that well? They're already doing it. And encouraging adults to become literate in their first languages in order to successfully bridge to English. Many of us are trying to teach literacy to people who don't know English. It is important, if we want them to succeed, for them to learn to read and write some in their first language and then bridge to our own. That is where they'll be successful. We have to foster that if we want these people to thrive. Childcare, we recommend that new partners rise up to engage refugee communities by developing childcare initiatives, which take into account the meatpacking industry schedules, hire members of the various refugee communities, don't have strong religious affiliation, and collaborate with local educational institutions, such as Amarillo College and the library. I want to mention, even those people who are comfortable coming to a local church for an English program, they might not feel comfortable bringing their children and having them taught things that they want to have oversight in what their children are hearing. And so we need to address that issue going forward. And I haven't mentioned this at all, but I believe it very strongly that we need a better approach to trauma care. We recommend that new partners rise up to engage refugee communities by developing an approach to trauma care which focuses on the specific needs and experiences of various refugee sub-communities, starting small, and is accepted by those refugee community leaders. I mentioned previously, we asked that question, what would cause them to stay? And I asked that because I recognize that Amarillo stands to lose a lot. Remember, I talked about Samuel, my friend who came from Congo and resettled in Amarillo in 2018. Since that time, he has excelled. He got his GED. He went to work at a meatpacking plant with his mom, really struggled, was a bit discouraged there. He just has a drive. And so he got out of there, took some risks, got into classes at Amarillo College, got certified in phlebotomy and EKG. Now he's taking computer information systems. He's interpreting for the health department during the pandemic. And this coming Friday, he is partnering with me to teach the instructors at Amarillo College about culture in the classroom, to share his experiences about what it's been like to learn in our formal class environment. We stand to lose people like Samuel, who, if they are not offered the ability to rise up and become leaders and thrive and become educated and grow and give back, they'll leave, and they're going to leave their aging parents behind here. And this has happened in the Lao community, actually. And as they do that, those aging parents are going to struggle to care for themselves. And additionally, secondary migrants will continue flocking to Amarillo. Whether you like that idea or not, it is the nature of our industry here. So why not help these communities to thrive so that when those other waves in the future come as secondary migrants, these communities are stable enough to care for them well. I shouldn't need to be doing everything. The resettlement agency shouldn't need to be doing everything. Samuel is a strong future leader, and I don't want people like Samuel to leave this city. I feel like we have a lot to learn from these people and to celebrate about them. We're right at the 8 o'clock mark. We're going to open it up for questions in just a few minutes. I know many of you expressed that you're interested in how to get involved, and that's challenging because we're still in the midst of a pandemic. So many organizations are struggling to connect volunteers at this moment. Our own organization, same way, we haven't been holding our table talk program where people share a meal and talk about culture, but you can get involved in our face-to-face program, connect one-on-one with a refugee. You can serve as a literacy tutor in our Somali women's literacy class, participate in the future in our table talk program. You can donate. Look, we, as an organization, we rely mostly on donations, monthly donations. So please consider making a one-time or recurring gift to help us carry out some of these big dreams as we try to work with more partners in this city. You can do that at refugeelanguage.org/give. Other organizations, we're going to send out some information soon about contact information for various organizations, and many that I didn't even mention tonight. But some, just to give you some idea of the types of opportunities that are available. You can help Mission 2540 serve refugee kids on Thursday afternoons at a local apartment complex. You can serve on one of the welcome teams with Refugee Services of Texas or Catholic Charities to set up the apartment, pick people up from the airport, buy groceries. You can teach English with Catholic Charities or one of the many local faith-based partners. You can drop off donations. Contact the Corinne Community Organization. They have a board, they have their own office. See what they need, go to them directly rather than going directly through or going through people like myself. If you're a Christian, visit a refugee church service. We'll connect you with one. Just go listen and learn, or participate in a cultural celebration, which I know at the moment aren't happening, but in the future, participate in one of those. They are very exciting opportunities to celebrate culture here in Amarillo. As I said, we will be sharing a list of resources and contacts soon, and we will send it to everyone who registered and send it in future newsletters. If you'd like to ensure that your organization, your initiative, your program is included, please send us a short blurb about what you do and provide a contact email address and phone number. Also, I mentioned before, this presentation has been recorded, and so we will send out the link to this full video for you to use in whatever way you'd like. And I want to mention one exciting thing, is that is a woman I just hired, Jennifer Fries, who is our school liaison. Many of you are attending tonight from Amarillo Independent School District. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you have issues and you want to connect with our school liaison, please contact Jennifer. Our website's refugeelanguage.org. You can contact us. Our email address is there. We send out a monthly e-newsletter, and you can find us on social media. So please take advantage of those opportunities. And now that is the conclusion of what I hope to share with you. I hope that you learned some new things, and I hope that you're inspired to dream big with me. Maybe you want to start something new. Maybe you're bored. Maybe you have experience and you're thinking, I can do this. I can speak into this. Contact us. Let's set up a meeting and see what we can do together to serve these communities. All right, I'm going to keep the screen share open so that I can jump around the slides if I need to. And I'm going to invite Elizabeth to come and share any questions that have been asked for me to answer publicly here.
Great, thanks, Ryan. I do have a couple questions from our attendees here for you. The first question I have for you is, what are some of the major government agencies and players at the state and federal level that are helping with material assistance for refugees? And are those agencies losing funding that at a rate that coordinates with the decline in admitted refugees?
Yeah, so what actually takes place at the federal level is that the United States government has the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR, who works with local state governments to distribute funds and services to local resettlement agencies. In Texas, however, we have 4 replacement designees. And because Texas is so large, Texas doesn't even actually handle this anymore. They've opted out. And instead, we have these replacement designees that those services travel through. So for Amarillo, we fall under Area 1, and that puts us under the West Texas Office for Refugees, WTOR, which is actually headquartered in Abilene. And it is important to note, though I didn't talk about policy, it is important to note that as numbers have declined over the last number of years, the funding attached to those numbers has also declined, which has made it harder than ever for those resettlement agencies actually to do the work they were brought in to do. So that is a challenge. As those numbers dry up, it actually makes it harder in many respects for the rest of us. And let me relate that to one other issue that I've, when I talked about recent Texas resettlement. When Governor Abbott asked or tried to pause resettlement in the state of Texas, the Texas Cattle Feeders Association actually lobbied the Texas state government because they recognized that the meatpacking industry is so reliant on the incoming refugee communities, that they were growing really worried that if those numbers dried up, they wouldn't be able to hire people in those crucial jobs. And we saw that during the pandemic, how meatpacking workers were treated as essential workers. So it's important looking forward. We have to recognize that as those numbers rise and fall, depending on whatever administrative policies we have in place, the funding at the state and federal level will also rise and fall with it. So when those numbers are at their lowest, local organizations have the highest workload trying to pick up the slack because those organizations have lost funding. What else?
Thanks, Ryan. The next question is, are there other cities where Refugee Language Project is being replicated or where we would like to see it replicated?
That's a great question. So far, we've focused mostly on the Panhandle. However, I have met many times now with people who are working in other cities across our nation, just to offer my time to consult, coach them to run, for example, similar community dialogues. So I've given those resources about the model that we followed to others and encourage them to do similar things in other cities. But that's the most of it. We've also fostered table talk programs in several other cities under other umbrellas.
Great. I have 3 more questions. So first of all, how do people find cultural celebrations to participate in?
Yeah, that is a great question. I would say if you want to know about cultural celebrations, get on our newsletter list because we attend them. We're at the Buddhist temple, we're at the Somali mosque, we're at the we're doing Ramadan feasts with a local family. We're attending Korean New Year and Chin National Day. So if you're on our newsletter list, you'll hear about those opportunities when they're upcoming.
Great. Following up on that, are there any services that are currently offering multiculturally competent counseling trauma services for the refugee community that we should be trying to build off of?
I'm not aware of anything local. I myself, with this hope, attended a trauma healing course in Dallas a few years ago, but haven't been able to carry that out. But there are those initiatives in other places. The Trauma Healing Institute is the one I'm most familiar with that is doing very good work in this regard. And I hope that we can welcome that approach here, but it will depend on local partners.
Great. And then finally, can you give us a bit of a picture about how the pandemic is affecting the refugee communities?
Yeah, that's something I was tempted to mention, but I wanted to be forward-looking as much as possible. Look, the refugee communities really struggled when the pandemic hit, and we didn't know what to do until the city was very proactive to actually bring me into meetings with the CDC and the local health officials to disseminate information to different refugee communities in their languages. And so we translated flyers, we did video PSAs, and communicated as much as we could. And then we helped the city to hire a number of interpreters to make phone calls to help people understand what does it mean that you're positive for COVID, How do you access short-term disability while you're on leave? How do you check your temperature for some of them who, for example, might know Celsius and not Fahrenheit, or might have not ever checked their temperature before? And so the city has been very proactive, and I think over time we effectively engaged those communities and communicated clearly. Currently, I'm not involved in vaccination stuff. However, I have noticed there's one Somali man who's interpreting for the city who has been communicating uh, about vaccines with the Somali community. I saw just yesterday the Karen Community Association shared a live video of someone, an elderly person being vaccinated, and use it as a chance to answer questions. So those communities, they have leaders who are rising up and taking care of those issues. I'm sure groups are falling through the cracks, but that's as good as I know about right now. What I will say though, is that many of them are struggling just like we are from isolation. And many of them aren't attending whatever house of worship that they normally would due to the pandemic. And they're not attending ESL programs. Crucially, a lot of those ESL programs have gone virtual, but that is just a real challenge for so many. It's so hard for me. For many of these communities, it's just one barrier too far for them to access effectively. And so I'm hoping here going forward, we'll have more in-person opportunities for these groups.
Fantastic. And we just had one more question come in, which is, does the Texas government have any acknowledgement or plan that you know of to address the difference in citizenship testing between here and Minnesota?
This is something I haven't done enough research on. And Mike, I have heard this issue over and over again expressed from Karen and from every refugee community. And what he's alluding to, everyone else, is that so many people are desperate to become citizens, but they're struggling to get past the test in Texas. And yet they say that when they go to places like Minnesota, there's a much more streamlined way to pass the citizenship exam. I think what many are alluding to is the fact that in places like Minnesota, I believe they have an approach that allows for people who are struggling to learn English due to past trauma to become citizens anyway. They can have certain requirements such as high levels of English proficiency waived due to their traumas. And that's not true in Texas. But that's anecdotal, and I haven't seen actual policies about it. This is just due to talking about refugees. I'd love to know more. And if anyone listening knows more or knows about a potential way forward, please share that with us so that we can disseminate that information.
Fantastic.
Are there any other
That's
questions that you all have? Yeah. Don't see any others coming in. So unless I see another in the next few moments, we'll close. I want to thank you all. We had over 200 people registered for tonight's event. And that's extraordinary. We had people from other continents. We had people from Canada, around the United States, and over 150, I believe, right here in Amarillo, who just wanted to know the big picture. Thank you for dreaming with me, for being a part of the solution, and for working with me to be positive. And I hope we can do some exciting things together. I saw one question come through. Do these cultures typically have books in their language in their homes? How do I get these books in my library? That is a great question. I have been personally trying to get as many as I can. So I have a number of books in like small reading primers in Karen and in Karenni. And we also have small little books in Burmese, like picture dictionaries in Karen. And we have, I have some storybooks in Somali. I think I have some stuff in Dinka. But it's scant. It is true. Many of these communities come from language groups where there is a very short history of the written language. Now, my background in Papua New Guinea was to help develop orthographies or written languages for groups which previously had no way to read and write their own language. That connects me to what's happening. Somalia is a great example because in Somalia, their own alphabet wasn't finalized until 1972 or 1976. And so the adults who are here from Somalia did not grow up even having a finalized orthography, a finalized way to read and write that was agreed upon and used in newspapers. And so there are few opportunities. What I would like to see happen is for like story writing, like workshops for some small reading primers to be developed in Amarillo so that parents can read and process their cultural heritage in their own languages with their kids. And that would connect with our local initiative on the 5 basic things. And one of those is early literacy. That's super important. Okay. I don't have any other questions before me, so we will close. Thank you. And just God bless you all. I hope you lay down tonight on your beds just grateful for what is happening here. Celebrate with me the diversity and look to the future about the positive things that might happen. Have a great night.